That sound is a shovel hitting frozen East German soil at 3 in the morning, 1,500 feet from the American border. It is the sound of the Cold War's most audacious intelligence operation, a project so absurd that when the CIA pitched it to the British, even MI6 had to ask if they were serious. By 1954, the United States had gone deaf inside East Germany. For nearly a decade, American intelligence had been intercepting Soviet military radio traffic. Stalin's troop movements, Khrushchev's diplomatic cables, KGB internal chatter, straight out of the open air. Then, abruptly, the Soviets stopped using radio. They had moved their entire military command communications onto buried landlines, heavily shielded, lead-sheathed telephone cables, running through the Soviet sector of Berlin and out to garrisons across East Germany. Those cables were carrying 1,200 simultaneous conversations every hour, the complete operational nervous system of the Red Army. And the United States could not listen to a single one of them. You cannot intercept a cable from a kilometer away. You cannot photograph it from a satellite. To listen to a buried telephone line, you have to physically touch it. The cables ran along the edge of a highway in the Alt-Glienicke district, in the Soviet zone, under heavy patrol. The highway was in plain sight. 500 meters across the border, in the American Rudau district, sat a flat, empty field. In the spring of 1954, the CIA station chief in Berlin, a man named William Harvey, looked at the map of those two locations, and he proposed a solution that no one in modern intelligence history had ever attempted at scale. He proposed digging a tunnel, 1,500 feet long, 6 feet in diameter, lined with corrugated steel, originating in a fake U.S. Air Force radar station on the American side, terminating directly underneath the Soviet cables. By hand, with shovels and pickaxes, in absolute silence, while the Red Army patrolled 20 feet above them. It was the first physical hack in modern intelligence history. This is File 06, Operation Gold. The pitch meeting happened in London in the spring of 1953. The CIA needed help. The British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, had vastly more experience operating inside East Germany. The Soviet sector of Berlin had been a British area of operations for nearly a decade. So William Harvey took the proposal across the Atlantic, sat down with senior officers at SIS headquarters, and laid out the plan: dig under the border, tap the cables, share the take 50-50. The British agreed. 3 British SIS officers were briefed on Operation Gold. The most junior was a 31-year-old officer named George Blake. Blake was respected. Blake was promising. Blake was, in the assessment of his superiors, one of the rising stars of British foreign intelligence. He had been captured by the North Koreans in 1950, while serving as a vice consul in Seoul, held in captivity for 3 years, and returned to British service in 1953, with what his colleagues described as a renewed dedication to the Anglo-American intelligence partnership. Blake had not, in fact, returned to British service in any meaningful sense. While in captivity in North Korea, he had been recruited by Soviet intelligence officers. By the time he sat in that London briefing room, looking at the schematic of the Berlin Tunnel, George Blake was a fully controlled KGB asset. That night, Blake walked out of SIS headquarters with the operational details memorized. He met his Soviet handler in a parked car on a quiet residential street in North London. He handed over a complete description of the proposed tunnel: its location, its length, its target cables, its projected completion timeline. By the time the CIA broke ground in the Rudau plot the following spring, the KGB had been studying the operation for almost a year, and Moscow had already made the decision. The KGB would not stop the tunnel. They would not warn the Soviet military command on the East Berlin lines. They would not even quietly reroute the cables. To do any of those things would have been to admit they had a source inside MI6. And that admission would have led the British to George Blake. George Blake was, in the cold calculus of Soviet intelligence, more valuable than the entire Berlin Tunnel. So Moscow chose the deception. For the next 11 months, the KGB watched the Americans dig. They authorized a controlled feed of real but non-fatal intelligence to flow over the tapped cables. Enough to keep the CIA convinced the operation was working. Not enough to compromise actual Soviet operations. The CIA station in Berlin would receive 50,000 reels of magnetic tape from those cables. Before the operation ended, almost every word on those tapes had been pre-approved by Moscow. For 8 months, the American Army engineers and a small team of CIA case officers dug under the East German border by hand. They worked in 3 shifts, around the clock. Every blow of every pickaxe was muffled by sandbags on the tunnel walls. Every conversation between workers was conducted in whispers. Above them, 20 feet up, the Soviet patrols moved across the highway shoulder, completely unaware that an American operation was creeping forward beneath their feet, at a rate of about 6 feet per day. The most pressing logistical problem was the dirt. 3,000 cubic feet of East German soil had to be excavated, hauled up the wooden stairs into the warehouse, and removed from the American sector entirely. They could not simply pile it nearby. A sudden mountain of fresh earth at a U.S. Air Force radar station would attract immediate attention. So they smuggled it out in shifts in unmarked army trucks at 3 in the morning. Bag by bag. 3,000 cubic feet of evidence dispersed into pits in the West German woods. Then, in the winter of 1955, the operation almost died. The vacuum tube amplifiers running in the underground tap chamber generated heat. A great deal of heat. Enough heat that on the surface above, in a particular straight line directly tracking the path of the tunnel, the snow began to melt. A reconnaissance photograph caught it from a Soviet aircraft. A perfectly straight line of bare earth running across an otherwise snow-covered American field, pointing directly toward the East German border. In any sane intelligence service, that photograph would have been a flashing red alert. The KGB would have raided the American compound within a week. But the KGB had a different agenda. They had George Blake to protect. They sat on the photograph. They filed it. They told no one. The CIA, for their part, scrambled. They installed industrial-grade air conditioning along the entire 1,500-foot length of the tunnel. They cooled the chamber to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The melt line disappeared. In February of 1955, 11 months after breaking ground, the tunnel reached the Soviet cables. A 2-man crew lowered themselves into the final tap chamber and stripped the lead sheathing off 3 Soviet military landlines, using induction coil clamps, a non-invasive technology that reads the electromagnetic signature of an active cable without piercing it. They tapped 1,200 simultaneous Soviet voice and telegraph circuits, without causing a single millivolt of detectable signal loss on the source side. They flipped the switch. The vacuum tubes glowed amber. The tape recorders began to spin. Operation Gold was operational. It would record 50,000 reels of magnetic tape over the next 11 months. Every word a Soviet field commander spoke. Every coded telegram a Stasi colonel sent. And every single hour of those tapes had been approved in advance by Moscow. For 11 months, the deception held. In the CIA Berlin station, William Harvey reviewed a steady stream of fresh transcripts every day. He watched the case officers below him work in shifts, transcribing Soviet conversations into English, organizing them by source command, by region, by topic. The intelligence haul was, on paper, unprecedented. The transcripts described Soviet troop strengths at standard peacetime levels. They described diplomatic discussions consistent with what the Americans already knew from open-source signals. They described internal Soviet bureaucratic disputes, mid-level officer reassignments, ordinary military housekeeping. What the transcripts did not contain, what they were specifically engineered not to contain, was anything operationally damaging to the Soviet Union. The KGB had assembled, in Moscow, a small dedicated unit whose entire job was to script the feed. Junior Soviet officers would call certain pre-designated compromised lines and read from typed sheets prepared in advance. The lines were live, the voices were real. The conversations had the cadence and texture of authentic military traffic. They simply contained no information of strategic value. The Americans, listening through their induction taps 1,500 feet beneath the East German border, captured every word. Every single hour of audio that passed through the Berlin Tunnel from spring 1955 through spring 1956 had been pre-cleared in Moscow. The CIA produced 50,000 reels of magnetic tape from those cables. Decades later, when intelligence historians were finally able to compare the American transcripts to the contemporary internal Soviet record, the assessment was sobering. The strategic intelligence value of the entire 11-month operation was, in the language of one declassified CIA postmortem, marginal at best. The single most valuable intelligence the United States obtained from the most expensive physical hack in the history of espionage was the names of a few mid-level KGB officers in East Berlin, names that the KGB had cleared in advance for release. The Americans, sitting in their tap chamber under the highway, had no idea any of this was happening. They were the deafest men in Berlin. The Soviet maintenance crew that discovered the Berlin Tunnel on the morning of April 22, 1956, had not been searching for it, officially. Officially, they were a routine Red Army communications team responding to weather damage on a buried cable run. Officially, they were astonished to discover that beneath the surface of an ordinary East German highway shoulder lay a fully equipped American intelligence chamber, packed with Western reel-to-reel tape recorders and induction taps physically clamped onto Soviet military landlines. The KGB held a press conference in East Berlin 2 days later. They invited Western journalists. They displayed the captured equipment. They denounced the operation as a flagrant violation of Soviet sovereignty, a brazen act of imperialist espionage, and so on. The propaganda blowback did not go the way Moscow had planned. The Western press, looking at 1,500 feet of perfectly engineered American tunneling, packed with state-of-the-art listening equipment, reported the story as an engineering triumph. London newspapers ran headlines about American ingenuity. Paris papers compared the tunnel to the pyramids. New York covered it as a Cold War heist worthy of cinema. The KGB, in trying to publicly humiliate the United States, ended up giving the United States the better story. Then, 5 years later, in 1961, the KGB's bigger problem surfaced. Another mole inside the British Secret Services. A Polish intelligence officer who defected to the West named names. One of those names was George Blake. Blake was arrested at his desk at SIS headquarters. Investigators interrogated him for weeks. The case against him was overwhelming. He was put on trial at the Old Bailey, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to 42 years in prison, the longest sentence in modern British history at the time. Blake served only 5 years. In 1966, he climbed the wall of Wormwood Scrubs prison with a rope ladder, smuggled in by a sympathetic ex-cellmate, was driven across the channel in a camper van, and was eventually delivered into KGB custody in East Berlin. The Soviets transferred him to Moscow. He lived in Moscow for the next 53 years. He gave occasional interviews. He wrote a memoir. He was awarded the Order of Lenin. He was photographed at his Moscow apartment in his 80s. Unrepentant, lucid, drinking Russian tea, fully convinced that he had been on the right side of history. George Blake died in Moscow in December of 2020, aged 98. Operation Gold, the most ambitious physical hack in modern intelligence history. 11 months of subterranean digging. 50,000 reels of magnetic tape. An engineering achievement that the world is still impressed by. Had been compromised on day one by a single man who walked into a London briefing room and walked out with the entire blueprint memorized. The tunnel under Berlin was a triumph. The intelligence it produced was theater. Operation Gold taught modern intelligence a lesson that has been relearned painfully every decade since. You can build the most sophisticated technical hack in human history. You can dig a 1,500-foot tunnel under your enemy's border by hand. You can install induction taps on 1,200 simultaneous live military circuits without causing a single millivolt of detectable signal loss. You can engineer your way around every physical, electrical, and operational obstacle that a hostile intelligence service can put in your path. And it will all mean nothing. Every single hour of that effort, every dollar of that budget, every reel of magnetic tape. If a single man with a security clearance walks out of your planning meeting and into a parked car on a quiet residential street and hands the entire operation to the people you are trying to spy on, the Berlin Tunnel was a triumph of American engineering. It was a catastrophic failure of American counterintelligence. That same lesson has surfaced in different forms in every intelligence generation since. Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who sold the names of every American asset inside the Soviet Union to the KGB in the 1980s. Robert Hanssen, the FBI counterintelligence agent who spent 22 years feeding the Soviets the structural diagrams of the FBI's own surveillance network. Edward Snowden, the contractor who walked out of an NSA facility with the architectural blueprint of the post-9/11 American signals intelligence apparatus on a USB drive. Every one of those operations followed the same logic as Operation Gold. The most expensive hack in the room is not the tunnel. It is not the satellite. It is not the cipher. It is not the line of code. The most expensive hack in the room is the man at the table you trusted to be in the room. The session is logged. The connection is closed. The files remain open,